I put up the original video because a Jehovah's Witness had commented that more people died due to getting a blood transfusion than from not getting a blood transfusion. One of the things that this person pointed out was how basically the procedure can be botched and things like that, and then people can get hurt. What I want to point out with that, as I did in the original video, is all medical procedures can be botched. I'm not really impressed or moved by that. If you recall, there were aspirins that were released that were tainted with HIV. Another statement was that it's linked with cancer. The problem with that is there's a million other things that are linked with cancer. Probably the one that I thought was funniest was when he said that blood transfusions were used for profit. Well, of course they're used for profit. Everything in the medical world is used for profit. You go to a hospital, they charge you $20 for an aspirin. I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses are allowed to take mind-altering, highly addictive chemical antidepressants, and a lot of them do. Not only are those very harmful as well as addictive, as I said, those are made for profit. He'd also stated how humans were used as human guinea pigs for blood transfusion tests and things. It's the same thing with those antidepressants. They use people as guinea pigs for those and for all kinds of medicines. So I'm not particularly defending the medical community. I'm distrustful of the medical community as well. So I have no reason to really defend anything in the medical world. And I'm open to the possibility that what he's saying and what JWs are saying about blood transfusions are true. I just haven't seen any real proof of that yet. So my goal here is to really get to the heart of the matter and prove one way or another whether it is more dangerous or less dangerous. The challenge is this. I need to know the number of people in a year that die from not getting a blood transfusion and the number of people that die in a year from getting a blood transfusion. It doesn't matter if more people die from getting the transfusion than from not getting the transfusion, and the reason I say that is because, and this is my made-up example, let's say that 210 people every year need blood transfusions, and yes, I know it would be a lot higher. I'm just picking a lower number to make it easier to follow. Out of that 210 people, 10 of them refuse to get a blood transfusion. Now, out of the 200 that get the transfusions, 10 of them die. Out of the 10 that refuse, say 5 of them die. With this being the case, you certainly would hear things like, well, more people die from getting a transfusion than from refusing, but you have to look at it percentage-wise. Even though more people died from getting the transfusion and less died from refusing, that's 5 out of the 10 that died from refusing, which is 50% who refused died. Even though 10 people dying out of 200 is more than 5, out of 200 people, that's still only 5%. So that's actually 5% of people who get the transfusion dying compared to 50% who refuse it. So I've heard all of this about how more people die from getting it than refusing it, and it may be true, but I need to actually know the complete numbers to know what the actual percentages are. So I would need those statistics, and they have to be people who died as a direct result of the transfusion or a direct result of refusing that transfusion. Once you have those numbers, you can easily work out the statistics. And of course, if you see a flaw in this idea, point it out and we can adjust it as necessary. Now here's my end of the bargain. If you can give me these statistics and show that a much higher percent, and by much higher percent I mean probably around 50% more, die from getting a blood transfusion, that you have like a 50% higher chance of dying from getting it than from not getting the transfusion. To show that I'm not doing this just to pick on Jehovah's Witnesses or anything like that, what I will do is I will research the matter further. I will make another video which actually details why it's more dangerous to get a blood transfusion, what the different dangers are, and the percentages of having different things happen to you. And I will just make a video against getting them, and I'll also include in there information on bloodless surgery and things like that. Now, one thing I wanted to point out, and then a question to add as well. One Jehovah's Witness, when I had asked him why witnesses are allowed to get blood fractions but not whole blood, his answer was, well, it's just for the same reason that Jews can eat meat and they can eat cheese, but they can't eat them together, because God says not to, so we don't. There's a serious flaw in that. The problem is when it comes to Jewish law, If the law is actually going to cause death, they are allowed to bypass the law. They have a saying which is, the law was made for man, man was not made for the law. What that means is that the law was made to preserve life, and if at any time the law is not preserving a life, then the law is no longer valid for that time. If a Jew is out in the desert starving to death and he comes across a pig and he has the means to cook it, he can eat pork to keep himself from starving to death. Obviously, if he has a choice between a corned beef sandwich or a pork chop, he'd have to take the corned beef sandwich or whatever. But if that was the only thing available to him, he could eat pork to save his life. Now, this is kind of an extreme example, but if all he came across was like a meat and cheese stick that was mixed together, he would be allowed to eat it to save his own life. So by those same standards, by Jewish law, even if getting a blood transfusion was the same as eating blood, if it was to save your own life, you would be allowed to do it. And here's my final question. As I've shown before, at one time, organ transplants were against the rules of being a Jehovah's Witness. It was considered cannibalism. They considered getting an organ transplant to be eating a human organ and therefore cannibalism. And they decided in either 1980 or 1981, I forget which, they decided that it was not cannibalism because you weren't actually eating an organ, you were simply getting an organ transplant. Here's my question. If you're not supposed to get a blood transfusion or a blood transplant because it's eating blood, and you're not supposed to get an organ transplant because it's eating a human organ, and then they decide that an organ transplant is not in fact cannibalism because you're not actually eating an organ, then by that exact same logic, shouldn't it be said that getting a blood transfusion is not eating blood because you're not actually eating it? Isn't this sort of a double standard? What's the difference between an organ transplant and a blood transplant or blood transfusion? If an organ transplant isn't cannibalism because you're not eating the organ, then why should a blood transfusion be considered eating blood when you're not actually eating it?